It's week 2, Rule 2. For me, this particular rule sits at the top of my list of rules. It's the creator of other rules, and one could almost look at it as the foundation for ensuring best practice and maybe creating a catalyst for good leadership, regardless of your role within the industry. I personally think right now this is one of the more important rules if we look where we are with communication and digital communication within the built environment right now. We can continue to discuss the topic of BIM being an important enabling tool for the wider built environment. But before we discuss BIM any further, we need to discuss this concept of communication. Call it collaboration if you want. And it's supposed to be this open, transparent way of working. But when we use these words, collaborative BIM, in the same sentence, which is supposed to be providing this information foundation for the work of integrated teams that are working or driving value in and out of the design construction process and into the operation stages. Now, I've personally spent 25 years in this industry, and from my mentoring and training within the industry, I've watched champions come and go within this industry. And since establishing the BIM Institute, I've probably advised close on 160 high-level executive professionals within our industry. And almost every encounter or challenge that I've experienced has had to deal with communication in some way. And I'm not just talking about document management or common data environment processes. I'm talking about it far deeper. I'm talking about scratching below the surface. I'm looking at how teams should be communicating with high-level management. When I was a young rookie, I served my military service as a paratrooper. And we were trained to be highly prepared for combat. Yet, our communications were not exactly candid. And we spent most of our time waiting on communications from a higher ranking officer. And if I look at the construction industry and the advancing technologies that we have, I see a similar pattern with our young rookies today who are highly trained and prepared, yet they spend their time waiting on communications from higher management. It was Gerd Leonard, the futurist, who said, "Once upon a time, business as usual was good enough. No more. Where we are going, good enough is dead. Where everything is equally excellent and performance is reaching perfection. There's only one more space left to innovate, and that is you." We need to start reinventing ourselves and changing the way we start to communicate, not only through the technology, but we also need to learn from our younger generation, our rookies, where they can bring their skills to the project at the early stages of communication. And that way, we can learn from each other and at the same time evolve with lessons learned. And from my understanding and project experience, this collaborative BIM approach is supposed to help or confirm with the client that performance expectations are met while being able to access a source of information for the teams that design, construct, and operate, as well as maintain a project facility. At the heart of any project, the lines of communication are supposed to be set out at the earliest stages of the project, way even before the schematic design stage. And if this is done correctly and formally, then this creates a way smoother or more efficient project information flow, regardless if it's a BIM project or not. And I always think the communication gap is widening between professionals and the client's facilities management or asset management team. And we're seeing now with advancing technologies that are literally consuming the way we communicate. Yet you can have one of the best common data environment systems on your project. You can have the most detailed workflow communications as well that are set up, even to the extent that you've done your due diligence, performed on all necessary document workflows. But before we discuss best practice, this word transparency within the construction industry is debatable. For many contractors, construction is still very much a cash cow. And as far as handover goes, it looks great in a documented, finished product. Let's be honest, this is far from perfect. when you're down there in the trenches with your safety boots on and your hard hat, and you have deadlines to meet and budgets are tight, and there's this intellectual property or copyright agenda that now comes all too often to suppress this new collaborative way of thinking. If we look at compliance to best practice, again, let's remember compliance or best practice is a great idea in theory, yet the technology and the protocols on its own cannot quench the thirst for greater efficiency and quality in communication. And the same can be said about adopting standards such as ISO 19650. Yes, we know this can bring protocols and regulations into line, help mitigate risks, and hopefully let the clients rest easy. That helps it conform to the highest global standards in creating open transparency throughout the entire project sector. Our mentor for this week on Candid Communication is Dominique Schlepen, who explained to us the challenges that he's experienced on projects around communication on projects, but not just within the common data environment, but also the challenges that he's experienced with team members around this word candid communication.
So there was one experience with this joint venture with three major companies, Arab, Sabana Jurong here, a big local company, and Mott MacDonald, on a major tunnel project at the Changi airport. And there we tried to go, Mott MacDonald and Arab, they had quite mature systems coming from the UK, and they tried to, this was still PAS 1192, which then became BS 1192, and now it's ISO 19650, right? So they came with this full shebang of all these rules, meaning, you go through these stages from work in progress to then shared. You have these gatekeepers where you need a checker, and the checker cannot be the same person as the author. And then you have another person who needs to authorize that content to then be moved from, say, work in progress to shared, and then later, other stages to be authorized for submitting to the client and so on. Now we set all these up and allocated all these different roles to the different people. We also did a similar thing on the BIM management process, where we set up all these protocols around communication on the BIM models, that everything should be stored in these online models, all the communication. The problem was that the staff involved in Singapore was by nowhere near ready to absorb all of this in the given time. So what then happened is we then had a sort of halfway system where some things followed the protocol and other models, other communication went another way, which to my view is actually a worse situation than not having it. Because you then have you have models that been through this process, and then you have other models that been downloaded offline. They went through a process where engineers mark up with a red felt pen and tell modelers to do this, that, and the other. And then these models somehow are being put back into the system at another point by passing all the controls. We then have a system set up where you're thinking this Q&A process was applied, but actually it wasn't. So I then said, this is actually more dangerous than not having it. Let's try to simplify this process and take out some of the controls. For example, we had a modeler, and that modeler could not be the same person as the checker, and then we needed a separate person who is giving the authorization. Simply, we didn't have enough people. There were not enough people in the office to do that. We then simplified it and said, okay, let's bend the rule. Let's simplify these BS 1192 rules and allow the modeler to be the same person as the checker if it's work in progress and so on. And then we had another project, a smaller project started, and I took this as the first line. Let's not go full shebang. Let's go with a very bare bone version of the 1192 process until people get used to it, and then keep adding in more and more complexity and more checks and controls which also makes sense, right? Because you're going from concept design to then detailed design, tender, and these legal things and being able to have the full track record to audit, control, and so on, that becomes more and more critical. So this was my main lesson, actually. Like, don't start with a full protocol right at the beginning, but do a light version of it and then keep adding if you actually convince that the staff involved have the training and capability to do it. And then another aspect of what you call candid communication comes in, which is my communication to, and not just the BIM modelers or BIM coordinators. And this was another problem, that there was some sort of perception from a lot of the mid-management that they do their process as they've ever done it, and then the BIM people do their thing, right? Meaning that we do our BIM coordination and that, and the engineers use the red felt they print out, and with a red felt pin they give it to the modelers because the BIM is happening separate. And that's what I realized. It's very, very critical to, before you start anything, to say, are you engineers and project control people and document controllers on board with this or not? Right. And there, I mean, you say candid communication, but actually I became not candid enough. Actually, I became too aggressive because it was winding me up so much that I kept hearing, you do your BIM thing and I do my project controls thing and I do my engineering and you do your BIM. And I kept shouting more and more. And to a degree where I became a little bit out of control emotionally. And yeah, I think I should have been more candid, with hindsight, and anticipate that, and roll back and start from a real candid way. Say, we're gonna do this now, and how about you participate in that meeting, and then you show me your red felt markup, and then we see in a collaborative meeting how can we now add that information into the collaborative model, so then everybody can see it, and our partners in India can also see it, and have more of that approach. But I think this sort of came out of working with these international engineering companies. They set up a protocol and almost taken for granted that people can follow this because some team in London did follow that once. So we can do it, yes. But neither can all the people in Singapore necessarily do this, nor necessarily all of our partners or supply chain or others involved. So that was sort of my big learning lesson on candid communication. Actually, I had an earlier experience in Hong Kong where I was VDC manager on the West Kowloon station. And there we used these collaboration models. And this was a very complex geometry that after a while, all the site engineers actually knew that only by looking at it on the screen in the meeting room, they could actually understand the geometry problems and complexities and clashes. And that went, even that was earlier, that sort of went better because it was out of sheer necessity that they needed to see the models in order to understand that I could then get the buy-in from everybody, going, sitting in a room, looking at a very big screen and going item by item to what's happening here and then making a decision. So, but that was because this, I don't know if you know the West Kowloon station, Hong Kong has this very warped roof that nobody could actually document with 2D drawings. It was impossible. And then we had all these subcontractors models coming in. And we had this confusion throughout in Singapore that people had a misconception or were not aligned. Where is the line between a document controller and an information manager? these roles kept floating around and were blurred. And it was very clear that there were some people who took the role of the traditional document manager, meaning they have something coming, whether it's models or drawings, and they would be zipped up and FTP upload, unstructured. Then we said, no, we have a protocol that these the document controller also need to ensure naming convention, this, that, and the other, the data structure. Now, we then had a document controller actually flown in from the UK, who then took over that role. And that person was more somebody who came from had both experiences as a BIM manager, information manager, and document controller. And then it became clear that's the sort of role that's actually required in the BS 1192 or ISO 19650 now workflow. And whilst some of these traditional document controllers were able to upskill, it was very clear that it was only about 50% of them. Others were simply too long in their job as a postman and didn't have the ability to upscale to that level to even understand these type of metadata that is now associated with the digital content that they're, you know, where they're the postman of. And it's not just postman anymore, it's, you know, verifying that the data structure is consistent and so on. Now, I would say the document controller role as such actually has to morph into more like an information manager role. So I think on large projects, the BIM manager needs to be able to identify these roles, talk to these people and understand that these people are doing their roles, and also, and here comes the candid communication again, ensure that the engineers and project managers and all of them also participate in that, because this process can only work when everybody is, you know, playing part in it, and we're taking out parallel processes that are happening analog, which I think was the main challenge at all levels, including on the document control level, that things were just zipped up, downloaded and zipped up, engineers doing things manually, things being downloaded, processed in a parallel way, and then uploaded again, things being set, 2D data should come from the 3D, but in fact it was generated in a different way and then fed back in. All of these parallel processes, that was the problem. And because like in that process, there were maybe 100 people involved, right? How can I, as one person, control 100 people's activities, which goes from MEP to architecture to structural to specialists, civil engineering tasks, and so on. Yeah, so I think it's about being realistic, then setting up the expectations, communicating to the key players what they should be doing or how it can work, and then simplify it. If we cannot do the full process, we need to simplify it so it's under control and then add complexity to it. I think that would be my take. Because I mean, if you look at the full, and I talked to many people about this in Mott MacDonald and Arab and elsewhere and asked them, have you ever worked on a large complex infrastructure project that was fully compliant with the BS 1192 process? And I haven't met a single one who said that it was, right? Then I think we also need to be more honest, you know, and not pretend something that's simply not happening. Actually, this question of is it contractual or not, that was a problem. That in Singapore, contractually binding was the 2D information. Yet there was an agreement that the process should be followed. But in court, the 2D drawings, that would be judged on. If you think this came to litigation to a court case, how many experts in the legal realm would be there to be able to judge whether we followed a BS 1192 process or not? You know, I mean, you also need to think about this realistically. But in Hong Kong, on that other project, they somehow put more emphasis on that because that was this particular very complex roof that could not be described in 2D drawings. And there the models became what was exchanged, what was relied on. And somehow by necessity, that then became contractually much more relevant, right? And the meetings became relevant because then the clashes in the 3D models were reported, that clash report was circulated, and then that became a relevant document. And somehow it became so because documentation in 2D was impossible, given the complexity of the geometry. But I think both cases were like legally a bit of a gray zone, and on that Hong Kong job, I know that other parts of the station were also, you know, not followed in a BIM way. It was just like that part could only be done in such a way. I know that, you know, Crossrail London, I haven't worked on that, but I know that that was one project where I think, from what I know, they actually managed to give priority in the contract to the 3D over the 2D documentation, sort of in a global way. And that seemed to have worked. And out of that, but what went was that you met Jakob, right, of the DAA, and that Digital Advancement Academy was actually part of that process, that everybody working on the Crossrail in London on that project had to go through a 2-week training process to be able to follow that. You know, if we had that on these other big infrastructure projects, these components, as contractually the 3D is actually overriding the 2D, and you have that additional training in place. And also the UK is particularly mature in all this, you know, also from a legal perspective and so on. So I think then that can work. And now one BIM manager can make 100 people follow a certain protocol, right? Let's then, I think, first be honest, what process are we doing here? And let's do something that's not fake. Yeah. I think that would be number one. Let's then just do a 2D project and follow that, and maybe pick out one element and say, here we're doing BIM. Let's test it. I was part of a digital change journey or in a large organization in the Philippines. And there we said, okay, how do we go about it? And the idea is we take one station, just one metro station, it's not too big, and we pick 10 people and we isolate them from the rest of the organization. And with these 10 people, we follow the process and you know, and really go through it and give them the time and the training and everything so they can have that experience. And then we have something that's small, but it shows this is how it could be done. This is how they did it, step by step. And then we had presentations to the CEO and said, this is how we built the model. This is how the documentation comes out of it. This is how we're doing the structure analysis on top of it. And then we had a small showcase that was not fake. And that sort of gave a lot of buy-in for other mid-management and schedulers, and, you know, and then, but maybe that was, if you have a metro line with different stations, each of them is not too complex. I think that's, you know, a more viable approach than having one mega station or one airport that has a lot of complexity. So, but maybe it's finding these examples. Yeah.